Ladies and gentlemen, these are dynamic and volatile times. We are witnessing unprecedented economic, environmental, and social changes on a global scale and at an accelerating pace, which are disrupting our ways of life and how we conduct business. Without decisive, deliberate, and coordinated action, the world will continue to face economic disruptions, environmental degradation, and social injustices, posing a significant threat to progress towards a better future for all. Transformative leadership is needed now to not only address these challenges, but also to shape a sustainable future where businesses are progressive and people can attain prosperity. Business as usual is not an option. It now falls upon leaders to join forces to ensure businesses will continue to survive and indeed thrive. It is in this spirit that the CEO Action Network, also known as CAN, has been established as a closed-door, peer-to-peer informal network of CEOs. It is a coalition of like-minded leaders with a shared purpose focused on sustainability advocacy, capacity building, action, and performance. The pioneering members of CAN comprise a total of 40 leading businesses in Malaysia, representing more than 20 priority sectors. Governed by an appointed steering committee and its chair, CAN is driven by leaders committed to lead by example and determined to accelerate sustainable business practices in Malaysia. CAN is a unique platform where CEOs convene to mobilize collective commitments, project a united voice for common themes across corporate Malaysia. CAN hopes to inspire collective action through the exchange of skills, resources, networks, learnings, all towards achieving tangible results for businesses and supporting the ecosystem with positive economic, environmental, social, and governance impacts. We invite you to collaborate with us to drive sustainability for the greater good of the industries that we represent and the businesses that we are championing for growth. You will have an opportunity to work with your fellow CEOs to create a powerful force, a force that would help shape policies, align with stakeholders, and create a favorable ecosystem for business and sustainable development. Businesses are under unprecedented pressure, be it from investors, regulators, financiers, customers, and staff. Many, if not all, are demanding that we demonstrate our sustainability credentials and climate resilience against the backdrop of global warming and climate change. Not only must we articulate our climate ambitions, the expectation is steadily building for business to demonstrate the ability to transition in support of the Paris Agreement's goals. With this in mind, there is an urgent need for an alignment of government policies between economic, climate, and energy priorities against the backdrop of socio-economic well-being of citizens. When government policies are explicit, clear, and coherent, the private sector will be in a better position to drive actions to support a smooth transition for businesses and the public alike. On this note, the members of CAN have been working closely with a small group of partners to facilitate a multi-ministerial engagement to strengthen our national climate ambition. We would like to encourage and indeed invite wider involvement of the private sector and civil society in this engagement to capture the views and insights of as many key stakeholders as possible. The points raised during this engagement will then be reflected in the final report of recommendations for the government to carefully consider. We are grateful to our partners, WWF Malaysia, Boston Consulting Group, Climate Governance Malaysia, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the Institute for Strategic and International Studies, or ISIS, for stepping up and volunteering with CAN representatives to make this happen. Planning for a smooth transition will require a whole of society and all of government approach. Every segment of our society and economy will need to step up to address the very real risks and equally capture the opportunities which we are presented with today. Concurrently, governmental support by the way of policies and incentives will be a definitive requirement to facilitate this journey. Therefore, on behalf of the pioneer members of CAN, I would like to invite all of you to support and actively participate in this roundtable engagement so that we can collectively benefit from the diversity of views and insights from the best minds in Malaysia's private sector today.
Good afternoon, Chairman CGM, Datin Sunita, Dato Faiz, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to present our perspectives on net zero and climate transition. I'm Dave Sivaprasad from the Boston Consulting Group, and today I'll share some perspectives on the context, some global views, and some considerations for Malaysia. So to get us started, this is what we have seen many times, and many of us know very well. The science points to a global increase in temperatures in the range of 3 to 5 degrees if no action is taken in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we're about 1 degree over pre-industrial levels. And just to put that in context, if we consider what happened over the course of last year with severe economic lockdown through COVID, the emission reduction we've experienced globally is in the range of 5 to 10%. So it's a massive pivot to transition to a low carbon world and a low carbon economies across countries and regions. Now, why does this matter? Changes in the climate pose huge risks to cities, to infrastructure, to the potential of coastal areas, displacement of people, and all of this impacting society and impacting economies in countries and regions across the world. Now, where are these emissions coming from? They're coming from across sectors, and 60% of them come from sectors which are hard to abate, in energy, in transport, in industry. Now, decarbonizing these sectors are difficult. So if you consider, for example, hard to abate sectors such as steel or cement, it would cost $100 per ton of CO2 to get these sectors to net zero. Now, practically what that means is increasing the cost of steel or cement, for example, by 2 times what it is today. So it is very difficult and economically challenging. Now that said, if you take a view of, what does it mean for end users or end consumers, and if you take a view of the whole supply chain, this is work that BCG and the World Economic Forum has looked into deeply. The picture can be quite different. So if you look at, for example, the steel that goes into a new car, or the cement that goes into a new house being constructed, the impact to the end consumer can be in the range of 2 to 3%, which then changes the whole economic equation of, it is very challenging when you look at it from a sector lens, but if you look across the whole value chain, look across the whole economy, you can see a path where it becomes more feasible from an economic perspective. So that's the context of where we are today. Complex challenge, technical and economic challenges, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel when we take a more holistic view. Now, climate transition requires involvement of all stakeholders: governments, businesses, financial institutions, investors, individuals, coalitions of various stakeholders working together to address these complex problems. And we're starting to see positive momentum in this direction globally. So today, 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions have a net zero ambition. About 127 countries have committed to a carbon neutral ambition by 2050. So there's momentum. And as we look ahead to this year and COP26 in November, governments are starting to act and commit and prepare as well. In the EU, they've committed to become the first climate neutral continent. China has set a more ambitious target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, and the US is back in the Paris Agreement. So all positive momentum. There's also huge momentum building on allocating some of the funds for post-COVID recovery towards a green recovery. So notable examples include the US green investments that amount to almost 2 trillion, targeting 10 million new green jobs. In South Korea, almost 100 billion Green New Deal, again targeting new green jobs, significant investment in various countries in Europe, Germany as a notable example. From an investor perspective, there will be significant investments needed to achieve net zero by 2050. We've estimated, together with the Global Financial Markets Association, 100 to 150 trillion will be needed to achieve net zero by 2050. And half of this, more than half of this, it will be needed in Asia. From a corporate perspective, companies are committing to net zero. More than 1,000 have committed to science-based targets. More than 1,300 have joined the Race to Zero program. And this has gained momentum rapidly over the last 2 years. And when you look at individuals, this was a survey done 2 years ago, where a significant proportion of people surveyed felt that more could be done, and they should, as individuals, do more on climate and sustainability. And this was 2 years ago, and one notable point here is there are a number of countries in Southeast Asia that have responded, have responses that are positive. In Malaysia, for example, almost 2/3 of those polled felt that more can be done. Let me pivot now to Malaysia and some considerations for Malaysia to consider. Today, Malaysia's emissions come primarily from energy, transport, and industry. These are the major contributors of emissions in the country. Now, that said, Malaysia has a unique natural advantage of forests and biodiversity, which act as a natural carbon sink. By estimates from the UN reports on Malaysia's climate program, almost 70% of emissions are removed by natural sinks in the country. So this is a huge natural advantage that Malaysia has, the forests in the country. And as you look ahead on where are the potential opportunities for a positive climate transition and a potential net zero pathway, 5 sectors are critical to this, and there are many opportunities and levers behind these sectors that could support a low carbon path. In energy, it's adoption of renewables, demand side management, energy efficiency. In transport, it's shifting towards low carbon transport sources, whether that's EVs or low carbon fuels, shared mobility and public infrastructure that reduces the carbon intensity of mobility. In industry, it's energy efficiency and changing operational processes. In buildings, is green construction, and finally in land use, agriculture, and forestry, huge opportunities in preserving the forests. New forms of agriculture, nature-based solutions, all could contribute to a positive climate path for the country. Now, Malaysia in a net zero future could look very different. The economy would look different. The jobs people would do would look different. The way we live and work could look very different. Now this is a vision of the future that could be. And the pathways, there are many pathways that could get us there, but they are complex and they're not easy paths to take forward. There are many considerations that need to be evaluated, and here are a few considerations. In any pathway, what is the economic impact and the social impact for the country? What are the levels of investment needed to transition? What's the potential of different technologies to play a role in a low carbon economy for the future? How will consumer behavior need to change? What is the impact on trade for the country as different trading partners apply carbon pricing in both domestically and to the imports that they receive, some of which may come from Malaysia. What is the role of multilateral cooperation in this pathway, and what are the policy requirements needed for all of this to happen? So many considerations that need to be evaluated and assessed. Now, to contribute to this pathway, WWF and BCG are undertaking a joint study that is intended to explore these pathways, assess some of the impact of these considerations. And it's intended as an independent study with analysis facts to serve as a resource for stakeholders to consider, both in the private and the public sector, as a reference, as a source that could be used as input into decisions and actions they may take. And looking ahead, we will reach out as a joint WWF BCG team to engage a wide group of stakeholders and seek their support. And with that, I'll close my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. So my name is Faiz Azmeet from PricewaterhouseCoopers Malaysia, and it's my honor to be able to moderate this webinar and panel session from now till, well, for about an hour. So maybe just to go back to the topic of the discussion today. The topic of the discussion says, can Malaysia achieve net zero emissions by 2050? Question mark. And why it's important to understand the question mark is that there seems to be a lot of confusion out there as to whether or not even small, low emitter countries like ourselves should be signing up to these things. Also, what are the implications of actually committing to net zero? And obviously, from a corporate perspective, what are the trade-offs if we're going to do so, right? And so now we've heard from the President of Petronas, Tengku Taufik, who of course is our leader in CAN, to basically say that as an industry group, CAN has come together to basically lead the charge, to basically help each other collaborate and basically make each of their companies sustainable. And I think that's a very laudable thing, and I would certainly encourage those of you on the call today who are not yet signed up to CAN to please do so. He also made reference to a report that basically CAN is essentially commissioning with the help of CGM, and that's really to try and pull together a series of potential policy measures that the government ought to consider or could consider, especially as they are about to launch MK12, RMK12, as well as the budget for 2022. So that was basically the main takeaways from the Taufik's message. And of course, he's walking the talk. Petronas itself has adopted a net zero target for 2050. We then had a presentation, and I must apologize about having to have Dave Sivaprasad's presentation through a video, which clearly didn't come quite across. The reason is that Dave is actually being called away to meet some individuals at CASA. So we thought of the two, that's probably a little bit more important. But the main takeaways from his slides is that certainly net zero is a very topical thing. As he mentioned, 60% of those emitters have essentially committed to net zero. I think what was also interesting was the numbers that he presented for Malaysia, and something which later through the panel we'll discuss further. But I think the other point which I thought was interesting was that BCG had done an exercise to try and understand what is the cost to the consumer, because clearly there will be additional costs, either in switching your power sources or remediating or trying to abate your emissions, but there must be a cost somewhere. And what is interesting to see is that from their assessment, the impact to the overall consumer is relatively small. Okay, so that's basically a summary of what we've heard so far. And now I'll basically be calling the panelists on board to have a conversation around that question mark, is net zero really what we should be doing in Malaysia itself or not? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically introduce the panelists, and when they do, I'd like them to switch on their camera and to unmute themselves. So the first person to introduce is Inche Alizan Mahadi. Inche Alizan, hi. Inche Azizan is a director from ISIS, and his particular area of specialty is a bit of a mouthful. I think he calls it TIES, Technology, Innovation, Environment, and Sustainability. And so clearly he has certain points of views which will be quite useful to explore today. The next panelist is from MGTC, Dr. Gary Teixeira. Dr. Gary, there you are.
Yes.
Quite appropriately, he's got a green background at the back. So Dr. Gary is actually a technical advisor to MGTC and has actually represented the government in some of the conversations internationally, in addition to, I believe, the Paris Agreement. The third panelist is a lady, Lavanya Ramaiah. Lavanya? So Lavanya, hi Lavanya, is actually the head of policy and climate change at World Wildlife Malaysia. And basically will speak to the topic, certainly as an NGO, about some of these aspirations. Now, I do have a fourth name. I don't know whether he's on yet. Is Mr. Joel Kwong on?
Yes, I am on.
Hi, Joel. So Joel is stepping in for Dave. So sorry, you don't look anything like Dave. Joel's from BCG and should be able to perhaps explain a little bit more in depth some of the numbers that were shown out. So those are the four panelists. My proposal is that we start a conversation, certainly on some of the key topics, and then I'll open it up to the audience to see if there's anything in particular you want to drill down on. But I think it would be useful, Joel, to basically flash up that slide you had of Malaysia showing the emissions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Can you do that for us?
Nadia, could you put that on screen for us?
Yep, let me do that.
Okay, so while Nadia is doing this, what I thought was interesting about this slide is a few points. Firstly, we're clearly not a huge polluter. Bill Gates famously said that the level of emissions are something like 51 billion, and you can clearly see from that chart we're nowhere near that. So Joel, this is obviously based on historic numbers, 2016, the last available numbers. But could you explain a little bit about this chart? I mean, for example, what is LULUCF?
Sure. Maybe let's start from left to right, right? And I think, just talking first about the first point that you mentioned, right? If we look at the, overall globally, is Malaysia a big emitter on the global stage, right? And clearly you answered that question, and the question is no, right? And if we also look at other countries in our region, like if we think of Singapore, like as an example, even smaller, right? But I think, it's important to shift from, even though it might be a small contributor on the global stage, it's also very important for countries like us to think about the net zero path because of all the implications related to trade, economic resilience, as other countries think, for example, about carbon pricing, carbon tax, that will affect the global economy. And us as part of the global economy will need to remain resilient to that. So I think that's just reacting on the point that you mentioned, right? Fully right in terms of identifying that we are small emitter, but still an important issue for Malaysia. Then we come to the slide, which is brought up on screen, and this is really the breakdown, of total emissions in Malaysia by different areas. So we first start by energy, right? Energy, constitutes between 75 to 80% of total emissions. Where does this come from, right? So energy is not only electricity, right? Energy consists of multiple sectors, right? It has, emissions from transport, light vehicles, heavy vehicles, primarily for that in transport, which is the largest source of emissions within the energy block. We have electricity consumed, by households, by industry. And the third thing that we have is also, use of things such as gas, as feedstock for petrochemicals, so on and so forth. So these are all fuel users, right, which fall under the energy bucket. right? So that's one of the big ones, right? You know, and then we have the other elements, right? It's much smaller, but you know, contributing to it, IPPU, waste, and agriculture, which are, you know, smaller parts of it. We'll come to that a bit later. But in terms of the LULUCF, it's really what is the offset or GHG emissions coming from our forest cover, for example, right? So, you know, Malaysia, as you know, has a large footprint of you know, rainforest, right? And that kind of offset because it absorbs the carbon. So that, you know, so when you think about net zero, we think of net emissions. So that's where you know, LULUCF, you know, offsets what's from the other areas.
So LULUCF is land use change, and forestry, correct?
That's correct.
So it's interesting that even they have their own emissions, 5%, versus the extraction of carbon. So where does that 5% come from?
Sorry, I missed the question there. And on the 5%, which one are you referring to?
Well, I'm just looking at the fifth column, right? You've got agriculture, LULUCF emissions, and removals. So that 5% is presumably generated by the actual, well, I guess by land use changes and other such.
So right? Dr. Faiz, this 5% is a function of primarily conversion of forest, cropland, other land to settlements. So as you build up settlements, that process creates emissions, whether that's industrialization, building certain things, changing up the lands. It's a small piece. It is basically the conversion of forest, other land to settlement land.
Yeah, and it comes from the second part of so LU is land use, LUC is land use change. And for example, when you have, you know, settlements, as Nadia mentioned, that releases emissions as well.
Excellent. And sorry, last silly question. IPPU stands for?
Yeah, so it consists of, you know, cement, aluminum, metals, mining, electronics. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, it stands for industrial processes and product use.
Yeah.
These are emissions generated not from the usage of energy, but from the actual process of, i.e., firing cement, you know, catalyzing aluminum, these pieces. So the energy is captured in the energy. Obviously, these are very energy intensive businesses, but they're not captured in this small slice of 8%.
Okay. So I think this is great because at least as a snapshot, we at least understand roughly where the issues are. And certainly it's more in the energy quadrant than anything else. The other thing, of course, as you say, if you add up the numbers, it's about less than 300 million tons. So it's not unmanageable. And I believe, Dr. Gary, you mentioned to me in passing that actually there was a point in time, not long ago, was it 2004, where we were actually net zero?
Yes. In fact, prior to 2004, Malaysia was a net sequester or a net remover, in the sense that the emissions that we had from all these sectors, energy, industrial processes, and product use, waste, agriculture, land use change, did not equal or was significantly less actually than the amount of greenhouse gases sequestered by our forests. So unless you're older, or sorry, if you're older than 16 years old, you grew up in an era when Malaysia was actually not only net zero, but below net zero. And we grew up in that environment, even though we did not have the efficiencies in, for example, Google Maps and energy efficient vehicles, etc., that we have today. We're living very inefficiently. And yet, because of the huge carbon sink that we had as a country, we were able to be net negative at that point in time. So it's only since then that we've changed. While I have the floor, might I also say that I just want to clarify something that Joel said about feedstocks in gas. When gas is used for combustion, then it does fall into energy. But if gas is used as a feedstock, for example, in the production of fertilizer, then that actually takes it out of the energy sector and into a product use sector. Yeah, and then the other component of the 5% in land use change and forestry emissions is actually from the act of harvesting itself. Now we have lots of our forests that are production forests from which we harvest timber on a sustainable basis. But every time you harvest timber, you reduce the carbon density of the forest. And that extraction, and is measured in cubic meters of lumber, is converted to carbon dioxide equivalent and included in that land use change in forestry emission. So it's not just changes in land use, it's actual, what used to be called the disturbance in the forest or an extraction of timber from the forest. That falls into that category as well. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
excellent. Now, I thought it was important to digress back into the slides because I think many of us lay people can't quite understand the problem. And I thought as an accountant, there's nothing like starting with numbers. But I'm going to digress a little bit to do an experiment. Now, so all of you on the call now understand what we're talking about in terms of greenhouse emissions in Malaysia, particularly, and where they are coming from, the importance, obviously, of the carbon sink. So what I'm going to do now is to put up a short survey, 2 questions, very straightforward. And what we're going to do is we're going to run it now, and we're going to run it at the end and see whether any of you change your minds. So if I could have the poll, please. Don't worry, it's not too technical. Right. So 2 simple questions. Should we be reducing our GHG footprint? Now, as I said, it's a trick question, right? Because we have 2 possible ways: the low emissions pathway and the net zero target. Low emissions means that it is basically going down a path, but not necessarily always arriving at a destination, but gradually doing so, or setting a net zero, which means at some point you have to arrive there. And the second question, do you think that we'll be ready for the next 10 years of a climate crisis? So please, well, it says here, host and panelists cannot vote, so I'll leave it to you guys to do so. So if you're not sure, there's always not sure. So can I confirm that all of you have now voted? Can I just check whether we can show the results? Okay, so 75% of you feel that we should set a net zero target. 5 of you are a bit more, I guess, cautious. And can we be ready? Well, not too different really, but lots of not sures. Okay, so I'm just going to write this down just to make sure we remember what we said. 25, 75, 0, 35, 40, 25. Great. Okay, so let's come back to the panel again. So this chart, as I said, sets out what the problem is in Malaysia. And so maybe I should start by asking some open questions to the panelists generally, but maybe since it's about net zero, we should ask the consultant to answer this first. So the question, Joel, and to all the panelists eventually, is this: is setting net zero target the best way for countries and corporates to meet the Paris obligations? And since we talked about a low emissions pathway, are there other alternatives that can do as much? So Joe, what do you think? Is this the best way versus the other or others?
Yeah, so look, I think any decision that we make needs to be based on facts, right? Which is looking, at the overall economic impact of this pathway to Malaysia, right? So and any other countries. So it's looking at, if we look at something we call abatement curves, which is we look at how much can be offset versus how much it costs for the country. That has to be a very informed decision. And certain countries like Malaysia, we have a good starting position with the amount of forest cover and LUCF that we have, right, which positions for advantage. But we need to take the holistic view, right, over time to see, what is the pace at which we transition, right, which is just and equitable for the country overall, right? So for example, it's a bit thinking about the timing for this. Is it something which is 2050? Is it something which is 2060? And that will depend on what's the best path for the country, which takes several elements, looking at what economic and trade advantage that we can get from moving to net zero, as we trade with the world and trade with big partners which also have their own net zero emissions. We think about the multilateral support that we can get also from our neighbors, right? So I think all these things need to be factored into account, and needs to be very fact-based, looking at what's the total cost and benefit to the country to determine the time, right? So, yeah, and then when net zero is, right?
So that's interesting. So it's true that in arriving at the target, you obviously need to do some thinking around the balances between development versus meeting a target. But I'm curious to know, I mean, the question before that we put as a poll presupposed that there were other ways of doing it. So for example, if we're just going down a low carbon pathway, would that not also achieve the objective of reducing it?
Yep. So a low carbon pathway, so it's a matter of degrees, right? So for example, you pursue a low carbon pathway, and one point in the low carbon pathway is net zero. It's a matter of degrees, right? And look, I think net zero sets it's a target which is memorable. People can anchor onto a single number, and it sets the right vision and aspiration for the overall country, right? Towards a eventual net zero target. The country gradually has to progress through a low carbon pathway, eventually adopting technologies or measures which get us to net zero in the end, right?
Okay, so just to spice it up, and before I ask the policymakers, people like Alizan and Dr. Gary, Lavanya, what are your thoughts on this? Is net zero the best way to go about this?
Yeah, thanks, Dato. Well, what can I say? Why are we looking at net zero, right? The ultimate goal that we want to reach globally is to make sure that the temperature does not increase beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. That is what science says is, the threshold. So that's what we're aiming towards. And in order to do that, the globe, the whole world must meet net zero by 2050. So that's the context within which we are talking about net zero. We need to remember that the goal here is to meet 1.5 degrees, not exceed 1.5 degrees temperature.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's something that we have to really bear in mind, and then look at things like carbon budgets that are available, because we have already eaten up a lot of what is called the atmospheric space, right? So this is what NGOs are talking about when they talk about, we need to have a fair share, fair distribution of the remaining atmospheric space. So when you look at any goal, any target, it must satisfy a few things. One is understanding where the country is positioned specifically right now, whether we are a developed country or a developing country, because at the end of the day, rightly or wrongly, developed countries have eaten up the majority, the maximum amount, most of the existing atmospheric space from the time of industrialization to the current day. So there's only very little space left. That very little space really translates to about 12 to 15 years, according to the IPCC, from now, if we continue along the same trajectory, business as usual right now. If we go along the same development path. So that is why we need to put this in context and understand also that some of the action that we need to take has to be taken in the context of obtaining technology, as Joel mentioned, that kind of cooperation, technology, the capacity building, even and especially finance. And this is what is at play at the global level, right? For everybody to be on an equitable, on an even path, and in order to do that also, the developed world actually has to stop emitting, if you think about it, because they have already exceeded their fair share of that limited resource, the atmospheric space. So for developing countries to actually meet their aspirations of becoming developed, there is very little left. But by providing this assistance, by providing technology, by providing finance, by providing capacity building, developing countries can meet this aspiration by not making the same mistakes that the developed countries made in the past. Yeah.
So in a way, there are 2 points that come out of your statement. One, I guess, goes back to Dave's slide when he had the barometer and saying that, yes, while the aspiration may be 1.5 degrees, contain it by 2100, the reality is we're projected to be more like 4 to 5. So therefore, there is a time factor involved here, meaning we don't have the luxury of time, right? Which is your point. So if I could infer from that, essentially you would prefer a net zero target rather than a low carbon emission approach, because we are short of time.
We are short of time, but what I'm saying is, from our local context, we need to assess, right, what it is. Okay. Because we are part of the globe, right? The globe has to meet.
Which comes to the second point, really, because I guess if I could put it another way, it's a bit difficult to be complaining about other people if we're not trying to do something ourselves. Yeah. So while, and I guess the point of the slide showing the emissions from Malaysia is that it's manageable, meaning that we can make a positive impact. We have been net zero before, but it may actually put, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but it may actually put us in a better position to be able to access some of these initiatives around the world, because we are seen to be tied up to it. But also at the same time, it's to be in a position to be able to criticize, because we are part of the process, not sitting outside. So, I mean, that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it. But perhaps now I'd like to hear what some of the policymakers think. So, Alexander, what are your thoughts on this question of, is net zero the best way to go?
Yeah, thank you, Dato', and good afternoon, everyone. I think the key thing here is that it's not necessarily either or. We have to do both net zero target in terms of long-term ambition, and then we have to chart out the pathways to get there. I think that's the key. Either in 2050 or so on, I think all countries will be looking to be net zero emission, but again, I think highlighted before is the time. And here, I think the devil is really in the details. So when we talk about net zero emission, I mean, what do we really mean? Of course, generally we're talking about balancing emissions and removals, but do we, for example, include just direct emissions, or if companies across the whole value chain, do we include just carbon emissions, or we include all greenhouse gas emissions such as methane, etc.? And in terms of pathways, what portion do we reduce emissions, and what portion do we offset the emissions as well? So all this has to be clear, and I think this is my point, is I think we have to look at both the pathways and set a long-term ambition, whether that be zero carbon by 2050 or so on. The second thing is related to what Lavanya has mentioned. So the first is more or less how we do it, but secondly is who should do it, right? Who should do it? Again, collectively, the aim is for, as advised by IPCC, that for the world to be carbon neutral by 2050. But who should be doing this? And of course, again, we've seen from a global point of view, Malaysia emits about, I think, 0.7% of carbon emissions. So we can say perhaps from an ethical, from a rights point of view, that Malaysia does not have the responsibility to be leading in this. However, I think Joel mentioned ultimately Malaysia is a trading nation. And from a trade point of view, it would be good to demonstrate that leadership to ensure that in the future, there will be certain border adjustment mechanisms such as carbon tax, etc., that our industries are in fact climate resilient. So we have to take that into consideration. And also from an international point of view, as you have mentioned, that and Gary was mentioning that before 2004, we were actually a net carbon sink. So in that case, there's been recently a lot of talk about demonstrating climate leadership globally. And this is from a kind of international point of view. So I would say quite simply, again, the devil's in the detail. We have to look into the feasibility, as Lavanya says, from a Malaysian context. We have to really understand whether it's feasible. But if it is feasible, it would be great to demonstrate that leadership globally, as well as it would also ensure that our industries are resilient to climate change and border adjustment measures.
Alisa, you raised an interesting point. And maybe just reflecting on something I heard the president of Petronas say, Because when he was asked in a public forum, so why is Petronas setting a net zero target? His answer was, because my suppliers are demanding it. And I think you made references to that. So let's explore that, right? Because you're right, we're a trading nation. And I think Asia is seen as being the manufacturing hub for the world. You know, if you want something cheap and nasty, this is the place to build it. But the problem is that we are the end of the chain, right? In the sense that we are obviously, well, basically other people dictate the pricing and requirements to us. We're not the person dictating it. So in your view, can you see that this expectation of the people that we're selling to, particularly in the countries who are net zero, could that impact our current corporates?
Well, again, being a trading nation, I think ultimately many of our consumers are international. So I don't think there is much choice. But let me also say, I think sometimes we look at it again from an either-or perspective. From the international front, from the intergovernmental processes, I think Malaysia should be steadfast in highlighting that Malaysia should not be coerced into leading this net zero emission, etc. target. But again, from a consumer's perspective, I think it depends on the sectors. I think that's the answer. But many sectors, again, being a trading nation, that they may be there may be no choice really if certain measures are being like, for example, carbon tax, carbon pricing measures are being applied across the border. So it depends on the sectors. I think some sectors are relatively more resilient or rely more on domestic consumption, but those that rely on exports, I think, especially to certain countries, it will not be really a choice.
Well, we're certainly seeing an uptick in terms of other countries applying standards to us, be it on labor or the sourcing of the actual product itself and so on. So you're right. I guess that's one of the concerns. If we don't seem to be with the game could be against us if we're not careful. So Dr. Gary, so we've heard from the other panelists, and it seems to be a mixture of, yes, we need to because there's a time pressure to it, versus being not a major emitter. Maybe we have the luxury of being able to do this at our own pace, such that it doesn't affect our economy. Of course, what I noticed that none of the three I mentioned is the fact that we're still in the middle of a crisis. So 2050 is not that far away. Dr. Gary, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Dato. And first of all, let me thank the other panelists for an excellent range of views. Before I respond, I need to clarify that I'm here on behalf of the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Centre, and the MGTC, as it is known, is a corporate body underneath the Ministry of Environment and Water, or CASA. So I need to make it very clear here that when I am referring to policy, a national policy, I shall explicitly say so, and that otherwise I shall try to deal in factual realities, both at the national level and the international level. All right, so I'm very glad that Lavanya raised the issue of justice and equity. And Alisan has also brought this up, that Malaysia shouldn't be coerced. I'd like to take, if you allow me, a step back even further, and encourage people to think about this net zero and what it implies in the first place, and what happens if you use it as a reference or as a benchmark. The first thing I'd like to say is that at the international level, many of the countries that have adopted net zero targets are extremely large countries with large tracts of natural areas. And indeed, was mentioned by Joel, Malaysia is serendipitously endowed with large tracts of forests. Our colonial masters could have left us, for example, in the state of Easter Island, as opposed to the Malaysia we see now. In which case, you know, we'd have to make up the entire 300 million tons, 330 million tons to be net zero. So the danger in allowing a somewhat Western narrative to take hold here is that there's somehow a sense of comparability and equity or fairness in this net zero, in passing this net zero line, which in actual fact doesn't exist. How would you expect a desert country who may have large tracts of land, but they may be, we may be talking about Chile and you know, or we may be talking about Iran. You know, how would you expect, and would it be to their detriment if they were sort of penalized for saying, oh, we will not be able to achieve net zero for the next 65, 70 years even, because we'll actually have to work on reducing emissions as opposed to being able to offset them with. So on a country basis that already, you know, throws the ruler off. So the idea of say, putting a border carbon adjustment on somebody who's net zero, only going to be net zero by 2070, versus some countries going to be net zero by 2030, it doesn't make sense. We've got Bhutan that's already net negative. Does that mean that, you know, they should be allowed to emit and that markets should be open to all their products? I mean, so we need to understand that net zero is not impartial reference or measure, and that some of us, by luck or you know, other fortune, you know, sometimes by conquering other countries, have managed to amass huge tracts of forest which we can readily use. Of course, some of us have embarked on huge reforestation plans in Pakistan, China, Korea. You know, it's post-war countries. Vietnam has done huge amounts of reforestation, and for a country like Malaysia, well, then where do we plant again? You know, without replacing agricultural land, do we move into huge urban plantations? You know, urban forests. It's a wonderful thing to think about. That's the first sort of thing. Well, should we aspire to this kind of target? Well, like a peaking year, a net zero year is a milestone of sorts that you have to pass through. You probably couldn't pass through a net zero without having to pass through some kind of peaking first. And then you have to pass through net zero before you went to net negative, and you'd have to probably pass through net negative before you got to absolute zero. And therein, you know, we'd like once again to look at what Lavanya was saying and compare us to where the developed countries should have been by now had we stuck with the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. The second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol called for the developed countries to reduce their emissions 45% relative to 1990 levels. Okay, and since that all has sort of folded up and come into a new agreement under the convention, but nevertheless a new agreement, the Paris Agreement, the idea always seems to make us as developing countries lose sight of how things should be. So when the Western narrative is to have a net zero target by some date, it's very easy to miss the fact that you know, most developed countries should be net zero in a couple of years or 3 years or so. So it sounds as if everyone should be net zero by 2050. But if we think about it, the developed countries to have a fair share of atmospheric space should already, you know, be close to net zero and be moving into net negative. So when we talk about net zero, we need to understand it is not an absolute scale. And it's something that we need to think about carefully and approach very carefully. Nevertheless, with all the sense of ambition that we can muster, given our strengths in the economy. Yeah.
So Doc, if I could just pause you there, and just reflecting on what you said. Actually, it is very unfair. And in fact, I almost had a Monty Python moment when you were talking about what have the English ever done for us. Yes, you know, railway, civil service, and all that kind of thing. But I was just reflecting on the point you made, which I think Lavinia also referred to, this inequity, right? They're telling us to do and they don't themselves do it. And I recall this whole nonsense about the Welsh mine in the UK, which, if it wasn't for the COP26 meeting, would probably still be launched. So it's true. Larger countries, particularly the G7, do tend to have a patronizing approach towards us. But I want to go back to something Lavinia said, which is time. If we continue down this path and do nothing, won't we have an existential event in a few years? I mean, isn't it self-evident that something urgent has to be done? And so, without excusing what happened in the past, it's very gratifying to find, and this is the statistic that Joel's team put up, that 60% of the emitters have agreed to a target. So my question to you would be, notwithstanding the inequity of being told what to do by the bigger countries, shouldn't we, as responsible people for our own piece of earth, set ourselves, challenging targets? Forget about the world telling us to do this.
No. Well, the first thing I would say, thank you, Doctor. The first thing I would say is that we need to look at the dates that these 60 countries have set their net zero targets for. So it's China by 2065, developing country, large population, etc., etc. But we need to look at Canada and Australia and some of these other countries and look at where they're setting their setting across the line net zero. Then this sort of cascades down to the national level and our businesses. And if we're in a business where our primary emissions come from our energy purchases from the grid or gas lines or things like that, then we're sort of plugged into, sort of hardwired to our emissions. And the only way we could reduce our emissions is actually reduce using electricity, and we can't do that. So one of the ways I suppose to deal with this is to reduce the carbon footprint of the grid itself, which is what the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources is trying to do through focus on renewable energy, focus on energy efficiency, the feed-in tariff, and all these large-scale solar, net energy metering, rooftop leasing, etc. So yeah, so you're right. It's our ambition to use as we choose. Just to be clear, though, that we might succeed beautifully, and even if we did succeed beautifully, went net zero carbon, went negative, etc., 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 the global climate is still going to depend on what everyone else does.
Totally
huge
agree.
countries,
totally agree.
Huge countries. So
but at least we'll have bragging rights, right?
Yeah, we'll have bragging rights, and if we play our cards right and focus on adaptation as well, then we might have an added measure of survivability in addition to the bragging rights. So, yeah.
Fair enough. But so maybe a slight segue to this point, and I'll bring up the panel on this. So going back to the BCG slides, it showed basically the sink effect, right? And I was interested to see that, that little positive blip on the LC, LCF, CCF, whatever, LUSUF, was positive because of land conversion use, right? Now, I must admit, I'm a layman, right? I mean, every other day we have someone finding hectares of land suddenly being cleared without people knowing, and it just seems that the simplest thing to do instead of for example, making your plantation more efficient is just to find another piece of land and start there. So just to understand it, I mean, so it's not just about emissions. It's also about the fact that the rest of the world presumably are looking to us as being one of the centers in the world that has the ability to absorb carbon, right? And okay, I've read something interesting that apparently whales do this too, which is a bit bizarre, but it's something about basically them bringing plankton up. But anyway, never mind.
Yes.
But the point was that don't we owe it to the rest of the world to be a little bit more, shall we say, conservative about the use of our forested land? And so there are two kind of questions from this. One, is a plantation equivalent to a forest in terms of absorbing carbon, or how different is the absorption rate? So for example, if I took a hectare of palm oil versus a hectare of some forest in Borneo, I mean, how different is it really? And then secondly, aspirationally, what do you think we should be doing as a country, given the world expectation on us? Because I have to say that every time I see an advert about Malaysia or someone criticizing us, it usually involves orangutans and forests. So we might as well deal with the elephant in the room, right? I mean, what are we doing about our forests? So what are your thoughts on those 2 points? How different is the absorption of a palm oil tree or a rubber tree versus a forest?
I'd be happy to answer that, but I think I see Lavanya.
I'm just going to jump in anyway, but I'm asking you first, and then I'm going to move to the rest.
Absolutely, that's glad to do it. Glad to do it. Okay, they're not equivalent, and for a number of reasons. As you know, forests in different parts of the world vary greatly in terms of their carbon density. At the equator, we tend to have some of the densest types of the most carbon dense types of forests, and this includes peatland forests. It includes mangrove forests, and it's not just the trees that store carbon; it's the soil, the organic matter, the detritus, litter, it's everything. So it's the entire ecosystem, and a healthy ecosystem is not just plants; it's the entire fauna as well. And everyone thinks of orangutan, but everyone tends to forget that there's microbes, there's fungi, lichens.
Biodiversity, basically.
Yes, all the way to the insects that pollinate, and the health of our human or man-made ecosystems actually depends on the health of the natural ecosystems, for survival. So you might have, and forests tend to develop their carbon sink over time, and at some point in time they achieve some kind of equilibrium where the rate of falling dead leaves and decomposition and carbon in the soil results in a cycle where everything's in equilibrium, right? So when you come in and harvest trees, 5 trees, 6 trees, 7 trees here, you reduce the carbon density of that forest, and all of a sudden the sequestration capacity of the forest jumps, because you've dropped below your equilibrium level, and the resulting growth of trees that are waiting in the wings, as it were, the juvenile trees, that's a spur. So you get huge sequestration, and then the sequestration again tapers off as you get closer to. Now, if you are extracting and not replacing, like for example, you spoke of palms. The palm tree is a factory. It converts water and carbon dioxide nutrients into oil, and you're constantly removing that oil. So it's like a factory in the sense that you're removing the oil, but you're leaving the factory. The factory stands there for 25, 30 years. Okay,
good point.
And it so this is where you can compare our extremely long-lived plantations to annual oil crops that require harvesting, planting, tilling every year, and actually have a huge turnover in terms of emissions. And when you have the factory, you essentially, for an annual crop, you have to build the factory every year. You have to build your soybean plant, build your corn plant. So this factory stays. It turns it into structure, and leaves come out the fronds to be accurate, drop, etc., etc. So you keep your factory, and you just remove the fruit. It's labor intensive. Yes, there's pros and cons and everything, but 6 times the yield in terms of oil and other usable products, hard to distinguish, but hard to beat. But I think it's very valuable, and I think that Malaysia is taking a very good stand by not equating forests and natural areas with tree plantations, monoculture tree plantations, which might be woody biomass, but are still grown for the purpose of harvesting, and look at what would be construed as a byproduct of waste. For example, we've got latex timber clones. Yes, it starts off as a plantation. You're extracting latex from the rubber trees, but at some point in their life, you stop tapping them, and at the end of it all, you get a valuable product that you can turn into medium density fiberboard, etc., and then you can replant again. So therein you have a sequestration cycle, and that cycle is pretty slow because you're taking latex out, and then you stop taking latex, it grows, and then you harvest it, and it goes back to zero. So you need something to compare against your forest. for sustainable forest management, you actually remove a fairly small amount of the biomass and then let it go back again. But we do have totally protected areas where this is left completely alone, 300 tons per hectare standing there sequestering every year. Yeah.
But you make a good point, because you're right. Palm trees are really machines. And in fact, this is a complete piece of trivia. But when we got the International Accounting Board to change their standard for palm trees, that was our argument. Why are you forcing us to fair value the machine, right? Which is your tree. So what I'm getting from this is that plantations may not be as effective as forests, given what you described, but they're still better than having a piece of concrete somewhere. So meaning that it is still playing a useful role, albeit that it's really the crop that we're after, but the tree itself that survived. So maybe if I kind of step back a little bit and kind of explore that question. Alizan, do you have any thoughts on this? I know Lavanya wants to come in straight away, that's why I'm trying to wait a little bit. Alizan, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, of course, I agree with Dr. Gary there. I mean, that's exactly it. But at the moment, I think that there are not many studies actually to demonstrate how much, for example, palm oil plantations sequester carbon and so on. And I think that it is worth it to study, because it should be incorporated. But let me just have another angle into this, and this is more global politics, if you like. It's quite interesting. In the 90s, Malaysia was heavily criticized essentially for logging. And this, in a way, Malaysia's leadership in terms of sustainable development since the 90s, Malaysia played a key role for the sustainable development process at the 1992 Earth Summit. Part of it is really to respond towards the criticism in terms of logging within the 90s, and now the criticism is on palm oil. Now, there's kind of two sides of the story. We cannot deny that palm oil was the biggest driver of deforestation, especially from around the last 20 years or so in the context of Malaysia. But again, we have seen that there has been a lot of initiatives towards sustainable palm oil, and yet there has been still talk about banning palm oil. So that kind of just shows where this argument on the orangutans are. It's really, again, goes back to trade, issues of trade. Of course, palm oil grows only in the equatorial belt, so it cannot be grown elsewhere and so on. So we have to really understand that element. However, as I say, there's always two sides of the coin. We also cannot deny that we really do have to go towards sustainable palm oil. We really do have to look into practices even within palm oil that perhaps ensures that it continues to sequester carbon and so on. And also we have to ensure that in terms of I think we have set a cap in terms of palm oil plantations, that we do not further cause deforestation due to palm oil. So I think again that there is two sides of the story here, but Malaysia can show that leadership, and recently I do believe Malaysia has shown leadership in sustainable palm oil, but yet we have to battle on two fronts to protect us from criticism, as well as to also show genuine leadership on this front. Because also just in terms of if we do that, if we do show leadership, as you mentioned, bragging rights, as you know, as everyone knows here, bragging rights are not just bragging rights, right? They are extremely important to form our reputation and standing internationally, as well as in terms of our companies now, because a bit of a segue here, but as we all know now, there are certain attacks on our companies in terms of labor practices, etc. So,
yeah, agreed.
This comes into play.
Excellent. So, Lavanya, what are your thoughts on what has been put out there?
Yeah, thank you. And I think both Gary and Alizan have raised really good points, and I'd like to build on that and connect to something that Joel was saying earlier, which is, what are the opportunities? We have so many opportunities, in these kind of transitions. Big transitions are not painful only. In fact, if we look at it properly, we are setting ourselves on a course which which would be, beneficial to us, right? The path towards that cause as well as the, end destination. And the end destination is our own survivability, by the way, right? So going back to what both of them were saying, what are the opportunities? We have this biodiverse rich nation, and thanks to our commitment, we have, still that 50% under forest cover. So moving forward, and we've already touched on, the issue of palm oil, its value, how it's also, under trade concerns being attacked. But this is where we need to really look at all these things in a more integrated, holistic perspective. And probably moving forward, one of the things we really need to do is look at landscape planning, right? So looking at large tracts of land, from land right down to the seas, and ensuring that there's integrated planning. So identifying proper places for economic activity, cultivation of oil palm, extraction of timber, whatever not, in a sustainable manner, but at the same time securing that natural capital that enables all of this to happen, which is our forests and our other natural spaces, our thriving seas, So that's where that kind of thinking we really need to adopt and embrace quickly towards that pathway in meeting that 2050 or whatever, that goal that we need to meet to secure our survivability. And what I like recently was we've been hearing about ensuring activities by the Environment Ministry is taken in the context of planetary health.
Yes.
That's great, because that's the kind of thinking we need. That's the kind of thinking we need to see this in context. It's about planetary health, and that planetary health affects our own health, right? So, I mean, once we see things in a different perspective, I think the action towards it will change. We're looking for different types of impacts, not just, growth, economic growth as the outcome, but the impacts in terms of, not only growth, but also the well-being of people and securing the integrity of the environment that enables all this to happen.
That's a fair point. Sure, I don't know whether you have anything to contribute to this particular point about agriculture, the use of it, and so on. Any thoughts on what has just been discussed?
Yeah, so I think the point on agriculture has been well expounded by the different panelists, but I just want to build a little bit on what Vanya said about benefits, right? Because I think, it's the way that we think about, climate change and transition in the last 10, 15 years is very different from how we would think about it for the next 10, 15 years. And let me describe a bit why, right? So previously in the past, the push for environment is a bit more driven by, do I want to be a good global citizen, right? Do I, bragging rights, so on and so forth. But I think it's really shifting to where we start looking at climate as an economic imperative, right? Which relates a little bit to what Lavanya said about benefits, right? And there's probably the misconception that, the low carbon pathway path is one which should be very costly. It will cost the taxpayers a lot of money. And actually that's probably one of the myths which is worth busting, right? So for example, let's talk a bit about corporations, right? So, traditionally for corporations, you used to think about a trade-off between, shareholder return and doing good for the environment. But now that dynamic is changing, right? With ESG investing, right? With, for example, people putting their money where their mouth is, that's changing. The trade-offs are collapsing. Another thing, if we think about governments, we always talk about the energy trilemma, right? Balancing between sustainability, equity, and security. And traditionally, that used to be a major trade-off. But as technology has improved, as things such as border adjustment mechanisms come in, we see that triangle, that trilemma, is really collapsing. Let me just give one example very quickly, right? Let's talk about solar energy compared to coal. The previous argument was always that coal is a cheaper source of fuel, right? And for a developing country, we should go with coal. But that trade-off is very quickly changing with how fast solar is progressing as a technology. It is becoming even cheaper than coal. It's obviously more sustainable, and from a security perspective, because it's an indigenous resource as well. So we see really that trilemma collapsing, not in all places, but many places, and that really reduces the trade-offs and costs. And in fact, the low carbon pathway could be one which is economically beneficial for the country. It's an economic imperative. And I think that's the paradigm shift that we need to bring our citizens on a journey in some ways.
But maybe, Joe, just to dive in a little bit. I thought it's certainly true that the cost per installed watt of a solar farm is getting cheaper. And recently, I think the LS4, I think it was what, 18 cents per kilowatt, which is pretty good. The only problem is that 722, when we all break for fast, it goes down. And so, we still haven't quite figured out what do we do at the nighttime, right? How do you store this energy in a way that can be used practically when, if you like, most of that energy used in the day is probably at night when you cook and, you come together and so on. So I'm just wondering, from your perusal, if we did go down the RE path, which is principally for us anyway, hydro dams and solar, what do we do about the, this issue about using solar at night? Are there technologies now that we can use?
So yeah, absolutely right. So I think, rightly mentioned, one of the challenges with solar is intermittency, right? As the sun shines in the day, and in fact, our peak electricity use is towards the evening, right? When everyone comes home and turns on their TVs, basically, right? So, but there is, in addition to solar, there has been great technological progress on energy storage, right? So battery storage is one example of that. We will continue to see improvements in that, right? So that's, for example, in the near term. We also track, technology progress in the longer term, right? So one of the, another thing which is, becoming highly economical is electric vehicles. So as electric vehicles, we see on a 5-year total cost of ownership that they can be lower than internal combustion engine by 2030. And the beauty about electric vehicle is that you have a battery, right, which is essentially a distributed source of energy storage. People are thinking in the long run that we have things such as vehicle to grid, right, V2G, where this is a source of storage, and people, for example, charge their vehicles in the day, and then when you come back at night, that acts as a source of electricity. That further brings
I believe they were doing it in Texas, weren't they? Some of the houses with the Tesla solar panels were actually feeding the power in the house from the car.
Yeah, there are trials in place, not fully commercial yet, but definitely pilots which are happening. So these are different, just samples of technology innovation which are happening, reducing the cost of storage and making solar even more attractive, right, as the cost of storage goes down. So just a sample, but yes, big technology moves in these areas.
Okay, that's cool. Now, I know that as quickly as questions are being put up, my panelists have been very busy answering them. So we only have one now, actually. So maybe I'll just pose this since it's just popped up and I think it's a bit more general. So as a layperson, I can understand the nuances around the burden and responsibility for decarbonization lying more with the developed countries than us. But what is our responsibility and goal as a developing nation? So, do you want to start with that, Joe?
Yeah, and I will shift the question slightly, right, and not talk about responsibility, right? So I guess responsibility is one way to think about it, but in fact, it's advantages for the country, right? So it's a bit of a different mindset, right? So if for example, yes, if environmental sustainability was very costly, then yes, we think about what's the equitable position of Malaysia relative to developed countries, and we get into all those kind of arguments. I think the mindset change where it needs to happen is that it's actually advantageous for the country. Then it's not a question about doing the minimum, but how much can I do, right? Because it's really a potential source of competitive advantage for the economy, right? And I think that's a bit of the
so instead of being the naughty child being told by the mother what to do, we should try and turn it around to our advantage and see what we can get from the mother back.
Exactly, right. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question? I repeat, it's more about what is our responsibility and goal as a developing nation.
Can I jump in there, Dato'? I think I more or less spoke about that earlier, that I think we have to look at it from a few diverse perspectives in terms of responsibility, and in terms of, this is more of an ethical question, right? From an ethical point of view, I think absolutely everyone down to the individual does have a responsibility to contribute towards climate action. So I think sometimes in our narratives, we have to also be careful about separating these different issues. So as I said, at the international front, we should be steadfast in ensuring that we are not coerced, etc., at the international negotiations, etc. But that does not mean that we should not be undertaking actions on our own as best as possible. I give you an example of the United States. I think Dr. Gary will know this, how tough and how such a big team the United States has in the climate change negotiations. But some of the states in the United States, they have actually exceeded all the commitments at the national level. In California and various cities as well have also exceeded that. So here, I think we need to, when we speak about these issues, I think we have to kind of separate the two. I mean, in terms of responsibilities, are we talking about responsibilities in terms of rights and obligations at the international level? That's one way to look at it, but also responsibility as a human being, as our own self-interest, etc. There's another way to look at it. But the interesting thing, I agree with Joel. I mean, Malaysia, for better or for worse, we are predominantly led by there's always an economic primacy in Malaysia. I mean, we are driven by economic development plans, for example. So when that's just the nature of our of Malaysia's setting. So when we take that into consideration, I think when you talk about competitive advantages, I think that is kind of a real imperative that we look at it from that angle. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So the session is actually meant to finish at 5, but judging by the questions that are coming up, we might kind of end a little bit earlier. I think, well, I say a little lot earlier, unless there's any more questions coming up. But there is this one question which I think might be a useful segue to get like final views from yourselves on the topic, which is, can Malaysia essentially adopt net zero? And then what we'll do is have the poll, and if we have time, we can kind of discuss what that poll means. So the question that was posed was this: there seems to be reluctance to sign up to net zero as it's a Western narrative, but what's the alternative? And if we don't agree, we need to change the narrative, but what to? So maybe I'll start in reverse order. Dr. Gary, can I give you the floor first? So if it's a Western alternative, what's the alternative?
Okay. Yeah. In fact, there are a number of alternatives. We, as you know, have for our nationally determined contribution an emissions intensity target. But there's no reason why this intensity target could actually be more detailed and actually begin to be applied to all the products and services that we as a country produce, and then benchmark that globally and say, so these are Malaysia's strengths. These are where we will be able to reduce the emissions intensity of energy production, or emissions intensity of edible oils production, or something like that.
Sure.
Okay, because it's not a ban per se that the industry is saddled with. It's an argument about biofuels and specifically biodiesel. But there are so many ways to produce biodiesel, ranging all the way from using virgin crude palm oil to using stuff that has been used for frying and used cooking oil, or even stuff that comes out of grease traps in restaurants. So once again, the devil, is as I think it was Alizan who said it, the devil is in the details a little bit. And the way we look at it should actually be from a bit of a stewardship standpoint. I agree completely that it's a little bit of to them whom much has been given, from them shall much be requested. And we've been gifted with the golden fruits
Yeah, that's Felda's thing.
In the land of plenty, and in Malaysia's case, I think it's already happening, just albeit in a bit of a grey economy. 10 years ago, when we started looking at recycling rates, we were given some very dismal rates as official figures, and it's only by actually looking and following, where the newspapers were going and where all the paperwork from the ministries was going that I found out that there were fleets of trucks, going all over the country to every single government office and taking tons and tons of newspaper back in. And speaking to the association, I found out exactly how much paper was being, practically all of the reading material was actually being recycled, way ahead of what was the official figure at the time. And we had this great idea that we should go to the Ramadan bazaars and try to use cooking oil from there. And what do you know? It was already spoken for. So without a proper framework to regulate this and to understand how much is actually happening, we might actually be doing far more than we realize. And that should give us all the more incentive to actually keep going, keep pushing it further. Say that not only are we already doing well, we're doing better than we thought, but the potential is there to go even further, and that's very important. There is another point I'd like to raise, because talking about net zero means that many companies talk about offsets. And that's something that I think we need to think very, very carefully about. So if we ever get to that point, I'd like to a bit of time there. Thank you, Dato.
Right, thank you for that. And just on offsets, I mean, my understanding is that that you can't seek offsets unless you've tried yourself to reduce emissions. So it's not a feel-good or an alternative. It's only when you've tried that you really can't achieve it for whatever reason. But yes, it's a good point. Alizan?
Yes, thank you. I was looking at that question and I was thinking, Sunita.
Well, you see, this is what happens. I say there's no questions, and now I've got three.
But the specific question, reluctance on net zero, I think Sunita will kill us if we say we shouldn't go for net zero emissions having this conversation. But no, I think the thing is, I think it's really, again, looking into the details of what we can achieve and what we cannot achieve and what is the best for Malaysia. I think this is what Dr. Gary was saying as well. Malaysia can show even stronger ambition perhaps than that. We can even talk about negative or so on, but it has to be really in the context of Malaysia. Now, there is a challenge to that. I mean, for some reason, or rather this net zero emission has become a real, it's all the rage for now. So from a country perspective, now I'm not involved in the intergovernmental process. That decision might be, even if we are under immense pressure to also have a net zero emission target, then Malaysia then will have to decide whether we fall under that pressure or otherwise. Similarly, in terms of companies, I think the a net zero emission in terms of taxonomy, if you will, is gaining traction, and therefore is kind of perhaps an easy way to align towards international trends. Now, ideally, I think, like what Dr. Gary said, ideally, if we can change that narrative to something even stronger that fits in the context of Malaysia, then we do not necessarily have to follow the larger trend. But in reality, I think many countries, many companies are adopting it because it has become somewhat a trend. So, I don't know if that answers the question. If you want to jump on the bandwagon, go ahead. Understandable.
Maybe just thinking about that. So I always like to look at things on upsides and downsides. So we know the upside is that we're seen to be in line with the other 60%. And of course, there's money to be had, right? I mean, lots of international governments are offering money for people to do things that help the planet. And I believe that we're actually not the major recipient, right? I understand Indonesia in this part of the world gets a lot of money from various parties. So clearly there is some incentive to basically toe the line, make the noises and so on. But on the downside, actually, is there a downside? Because really, we're doing many of those things anyway. I mean, something which we've not discussed was the recent setup of the MICAC, right? Which I thought was brilliant. And I actually got the analysis to find out who was on it. And I realized every Menteri Besar is on it. So are the ministers and so on. And so if you want a way of explaining to the world that we're taking it seriously, what can be more serious that it's essentially a full cabinet matter, right? So my point being, actually, isn't going to be really that difficult just looking at what we're doing now, but perhaps badging it as being net zero, because we're already doing many of those things anyway. And Dr. Gary has also made the point, actually, if you look at the impact of our plantations, though they may be many, they're still positive towards the absorption of carbon. It's not as bad as other countries where they literally cut the crop and you lose the benefits. So maybe the point I want to put to you, Alizan, is how difficult would it be to kind of look at what we're already doing and calling it, moving towards net zero? I mean, and as you mentioned, in fact, Dr. Gary mentioned, other countries are perhaps less ambitious at the target. They're talking about 2060, like China, potentially even later, if Australia, and so on. So what's the harm of playing the game?
Okay, just from, I'm not sure actually, but I think what is the concern, generally speaking, is, again, going back to the pathways. We're not 100% sure of the pathways, meaning when we can become carbon neutral, whether it's 2060, etc. So I think there needs to be a bit more understanding in terms of the pathways, in terms of undertaking scenario analysis, and so on. So I think actually you posed the question before, Dato', some of the things that we want to ask: do we set the target first, or do we just go along with it? Now, at the moment, I think we cannot say for certain with confidence that we will achieve net zero, although we know that we are doing various good practices that may lead to it. So I think that's the challenge from the policy perspective, but I'm not sure, maybe Dr. Gary
All right. So what I'm going to do now is ask Joel for his comments on this, and in a way have a bit of a wrap up, and then I'll have, but ladies, you'll have the last word, Lavinia, and then we'll do the poll, and then we'll see where we are with the questions before we call a halt. So Joel, just thoughts on that. Well, I guess the overall question, should we achieve? I mean, is that the best way? But also, reflecting on what's been said, should we be marching to someone else's drum? Or, and in fact, I think you have mentioned this already in a number of different ways, that actually there are some advantages, but maybe we should be looking at also, so what's the disadvantage about playing this game? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and no, I really like the comments made by both Alizan and Dr. Gary. I think they really resonate, right? And particularly picking up from what Alizan mentioned, right, about having a real fact base, right? So we always talk about net zero, but just having clarity on what does it cost, what does it cost over time, what are the benefits that we get, employment, GDP, jobs, trade. And I think having this clarity of this fact base is important, right? And then, we all can make a very informed decision, government, citizens, on, whether do we want to go on this journey, right? So I think that's really the important starting position that we need to come up with together as a country. And that's the foundation. But with that said, looking at the fundamentals, Malaysia is in a great position. I think Dr. Gary mentioned that, some parts of net zero is a little bit of luck, right? What are the natural starting endowments that we have with? And, Malaysia is, looking at the fundamentals well placed, right? We spoke about our forest cover, right? We spoke about, how for renewables, we are in one of the best places in the world for solar, right? Yeah, we don't have wind, but we have great irradiation. We think of other transition fuels like natural gas, and, in our backyard, we have reserves, right? So in some ways, we have the right ingredients, which puts us in a good position, right, to meet net zero, looking at the fundamentals. Obviously, we need to do the detailed economics and look at the detailed business cases, right? But, it's a good step. And I like the point also made that, it's not about net zero overall as a country only, right? It's about looking at individual industries. How do we make sure that they're resilient and future-proof for a world which costs in carbon, right? How it's people talk about transition risk. How do we prepare our industries for it? Malaysia is always looking for new growth sectors in order to become a high income nation, right? And a lot of these global opportunities are in these new growth areas, driven by sustainability, because that's what the world demands, right? What global economies are demanding. Again, I would see this as an opportunity. So yeah, I think putting this together, just to summarize, need to look at the facts. Second, we are in a great starting position. And third, rather than thinking of this as a liability and burden for a country, thinking more that this is a source of potential advantage, right? I would just conclude with those three.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good way to summarize that. Lavanya, last words before the poll again?
Sure. What I think is, and this is the NGO perspective on this, it's not that net zero itself is wrong or it's a Western narrative. The net zero is what science demands, right? Globally by 2050. What is wrong is how some of these big, emitters have usurped that and said, okay, we will meet our net zero by 2050. I think the point was made earlier maybe by Gary, that some of these countries have to do that now. They have to do it now or in the next 2 to 3 years. Sure. That's the point. I mean, and so it's not that the net zero goal itself or the target setting is wrong. That's not the, we should actually work it out in terms of our own country context. And that's what we're trying to do, right? And it's important that we do set some kind of goal, because that then makes everybody sort of have a vision, a common aim to reach. So for these reasons, it's important. And it's important, as Joel has already said, to study the implications, to understand the benefits, and to assess whether it's costs or actually investments into a better future that we are making, right? So it's these things that we need to look at and actually properly study and collectively study. And that's why we all need to, play a part, because everybody brings in, value and richness to unraveling, to unpackaging this question. So I won't say that net zero is wrong. We should aim for it, but it's the context within which it is presented, and the context within which some of the developed countries have now taken it over. For example, if big emitters like, say, the US, Europe, who have been emitting all this while, continue along this path and only start becoming net zero in 2050, there'll be no more atmospheric space left. Nothing. Right. So it's not an option. Yeah. Before I end, I wanted to also mention something about some of the comments on adaptation, right? What people, it's true, we have not paid enough attention to adaptation, but we cannot see it as either or. It cannot be either adaptation or mitigation. They're they're two sides of the same coin. If you do not do one and just focus on the other, that's going to be an imbalance. You're going to have, if you just do mitigation and you are not focused on making sure you're adapting at the same time, all the investments in mitigation are ultimately going to be destroyed by the impacts of climate change. Conversely, if you just focus on adaptation and we don't do enough to make sure that we are contributing to that global goal of, threshold meeting at 1.5, that's also not going to work, right? And for example, in our own country, our forests, the biggest insurance that we have, could actually be impacted by climate change if certain thresholds are breached. If we meet, for example, looking at the oceans, for example, coral reefs will be gone mainly if we go up to 2 degrees, So these are the things that we have to bear in mind. It's not a question of, do we have the luxury of doing one or the other, focus more on one or the other? We have to do both. And by doing both, actually, we will end up needing to do less of each, if that makes sense.
Well, the more you do, the less problems you have.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go call for the poll again and see how views have changed from this discussion. Can we have the poll up again? Sorry, guys, you can't vote. Okay, I think that should be enough time. Can we have the results up, please? Do you have the results? Well, the first question, no change. The second question, less not sure's, but now the word no. Okay, so clearly, I think the majority still seems to think that net zero is the way to go, which is good news, if you're a net zero believer. But I think we've also understood from today's discussion that you can't think of just one thing without thinking about all the other implications, the balance between economy, and as you mentioned, adaptation versus mitigation. But I think the second question is interesting, that having heard what we're doing as a country, more of the audience feel that we won't make it, or rather that, in fact, can you just flash up the answer again, please? Is it Matt? Yeah, so can Malaysia be ready for the next 10 years of a climate crisis? And the answer is no. So that's interesting. So any thoughts on that before we end? Do you believe that we can be ready in the next 10 years?
If I may, Dr.
Yes, please.
I don't think we have a choice. I mean, to be very frank, we do not have a choice. The emissions, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, have already plotted a course for us for the next 4 or 5 decades. And even if we were to emissions to zero tomorrow, we would still be faced with this huge climate inertia that we have to deal with. And I mean, you asked a very interesting question before. What are the downsides? And I'm not sure if anyone's thought about that. But in I suppose in France they had some riots in response to a bit of a tax. In Chile when they raised the price of public transport, and actually did the calculation in pesos, it was a matter of a few cents. Okay, but that caused the cancellation, the necessity to move the entire COP from Chile. It was originally intended to be in Brazil, to Spain. And then of course there is the danger of betting on the wrong horse, as it were. I mean, we've got you think about alternatives to ICE vehicles. We've got hybrid vehicles, we've got electric vehicles, we've got hydrogen vehicles. Okay, so it becomes really important which horse you're going to bet on, in which time frame to bring this thing along correctly, and otherwise you could throw your money down a hole and become unpopular very, very quickly. And the other thing that I haven't really heard is, in terms of why should we, is the linkage to sustainability and the circular economy in particular. Okay, and there's so much that we can look at in terms of the circular economy. Using waste plastic and used glass to make bricks for construction. It's the myriad uses of the biomass and the biogas from the palm oil industry. All our organic waste going to feed black soldier fly larvae and producing animal feed domestically with very low carbon. And so if you avoid the methane from the food going into the landfills, you can rescue all that protein and give it to these maggots and recycle it as edible protein. When what we're doing now is saying that when our poultry is self-sufficient, we're buying 4 million tons of corn and soybean meal from Brazil and Argentina. So we're exposed to climate impacts.
But I still can't get over the idea of having a maggot sandwich. Really.
Well, no, then give it to you give it to the chickens, or we give it to the fish. We launder it.
Seeing as a food source for the animals.
Yes, so it's the animal feed that comes from there. The chickens lay eggs and produce meat because they're eating corn and soybean meal from other countries. And we're exposed. So if anything happens, a drought happens in Brazil, a famine in Nigeria, so it's win-win-win-win. Yeah.
I think, Doc, you're right. There are many other things that we could do other than just concentrate on greenhouse gases. But the good thing about our country is that we seem to be doing lots of things in parallel. So some of the things you mentioned, I have heard, which is exploring, putting plastic into bitumen to make better roads and so on. And that can still continue. But I guess going back to the topic, since we're looking at net zero, it is very clearly, linked to greenhouse gases. And really, and we've heard from the various panelists, the pros and cons, and to some extent, the bigger picture, which is we may not have a choice, right? It's really being dictated to us. Any last comments, Lavanya? Sorry.
May I just put in one small thing about, like I mentioned, about the idea of reaching or achieving net zero corporate level by offsetting. All right, because if you think about it, you've got your emissions above the x-axis in the graph, and you've got your sequestration below, and then you've got the net emissions which occurs because the emissions are greater than the sequestration, right?
Sure.
But if you were to say, I'm going to offset my current emissions with my current sequestration, I've done absolutely nothing. My net emissions remains exactly the same. 1 million tons off of emissions, subtract 1 million tons off because you don't double count, you subtract that off,
sure.
and you're still stuck with that. So if you're thinking about offsetting your emissions to have an effect, this has to come from additional sequestration to what is occurring now. And there is a plus point, because if we move forests into cities, we make it much more pleasant to live here in the city, while at the same time having new areas for sequestration, which would then qualify, or which would then, when used for offsets, actually impact the net emissions amount, right? So I did want to put that point out there.
Well, I hate to use that phrase. It's definitely food for thought. but actually, it does raise interesting points, right? Because there are ways of actually doing this to even help other objectives. I mean, for example, making the city a lot better. Lavanya, you wanted to say something before we close?
Yep, sure. Thank you. It's about, to respond to that second poll, right? And why we may not be able to do it. It could be that we need, more push. And one thing that was announced recently by my CAC was to look at carbon pricing. Yeah. So carbon pricing set at the right level might actually motivate the kind of action also that we need. So with a target, with carbon pricing, all these instruments coming together, working integrated in an integrated way, and also doing all the measures that we have discussed, including, making our cities more pleasant with more green,
Sure.
These are all the things. I mean, I think if we put all these, this wealth of tools we have available, we should be able to make it. And I think that's why it's important for us to take stock now of what the array of options are available for us, and do that kind of assessment, at least to have, some kind of big picture on how we can move ahead, because not achieving it is not an option.
Understood. And on that note, I think I'll have to call this session to an end. I think there were 3 questions, but from looking at them, I think they have been answered already about adaptation versus mitigation, and about what are the alternatives to net zero. And I think this thing about, what happens if we just continue BAU? Well, we don't have a planet, so that's the end of that. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to us. I will now hand you back to Datin Sri Sunita. Datin?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Faiz, and thank you all of you. This was just a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Excellent contributions. This is such a good start to this initiative, where we would like as many stakeholders as possible to self-organize, put their minds together so that we can collectively discuss solutions which can then inform policy making. It's been difficult just getting to this stage. Months of discussions and planning, an ambitious initiative which is 100% run by volunteers, and I'm deeply thankful to each one of them, many of whom you heard speak today. They have spent hours talking this through with me, strategizing, priming the many stakeholders in this outreach late into the night and well into the weekends. And this is just the beginning. This is a long journey with no roadmap, no silver bullet solutions, plenty of iterations needed, and there will be many unintended consequences. And most of all, I don't want to underestimate the amount of work or the necessity of bringing everyone along with us. I like to use the traveling fast, traveling far analogy, that if you want to travel fast, you can go alone. But if you want to travel far, and this is a situation where we need to travel far, then we need to bring as many stakeholders along with us as possible. Why don't we try to be on the right side of climate history? Because after all, if it was only a few years ago that our net emissions were zero, as was discussed, which is in 2004, the red line, then we can achieve that again if we focus on reducing our emissions and protecting our carbon sinks, our rainforests and oceans, which are filled with mega biodiversity. After all, the science and the data are clear. We already know which human activities cause the most emissions, and more importantly, we know what we need to personally do to reduce this. So while this is a private sector convened series of roundtable conversations across ministries and sectors, at the end of the day, it's every individual making lifestyle and work choices which triggers the start of the entire value chain, which businesses and industries feed into. Now, we certainly don't want to underplay the importance of our national negotiating stance. I like to think that we all agree with the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, referring to the different levels of responsibility that rich and poor nations will have to take on in the global fight against climate change. It's clear who has contributed the most to the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, which has been discussed by our panel. We also acknowledge that the most wealthy in any society also have a larger carbon footprint than the poorest, who regrettably are going to bear the brunt of the worst effects of the climate crisis. But when we consider that during the unprecedented lockdown last year, emissions only reduced by 9%, only to rebound again by the end of the year. So we need to remember that the scale of decarbonizing that is needed will only increase the longer we wait. So let us not allow emotion and fear to be a substitute for clear thinking about the relationship between means and ends. We actually have an opportunity to create a better world. So why shouldn't we take this seriously? Allow me to leave you now with this short 2-minute video of the latest art installation by Red Hong Yi, and all she uses are green matchsticks.
As time went by, Earth blossomed into a beautiful, natural vastness of green. Our human curiosity led us to discover its hidden beauty and its promise of the future. But in our strive to forward the human race, our Earth suffered the consequences of our choices. Has shown us what it is like to go through a dangerous emergency. That could happen if climate change accelerates. destroyed Earth. But it is also us who can restore it.